Imagine opening your eyes to a sky the color of steel. You're 10 years old, your breath turns to crystals, and breakfast is a rumor carried on the wind. Your parents don't worry about homework. They worry about whether the river is still liquid and whether the mammoths are still moving. If you fall ill, there's no pharmacy, only a bundle of bitter leaves and a prayer. Now, rewind further, then fast forward, then rewind again. Somewhere along that timeline, one mistake, a slip on ice, a stray arrow, a fever in a crowded hut, could have erased the chapter that would have been you. Today, we're going to measure just how thin that thread was by visiting 5 moments when being born human was a breathtakingly bad deal, and still, somehow, enough people survived to write us into existence. Stay to the end, because the last section flips the question. When is the best time to be alive? And what do we owe the ones who got us here? History is not a straight line of progress. It is a rotating set of constraints: climate, disease, scarcity, violence, shuffling like cards in a dealer's hands. Some hands are merely difficult, some are unwinnable, and once in a while, a child is born onto the table, while the deck is stacked against their very first breath. Imagine the simplest question you can ask about a human life. Not, is it meaningful? Not, is it happy? But can it continue? Strip everything else away. Art, philosophy, luxury, and track only the margin between a body's daily needs and the world's daily supply. When that margin widens, cultures flourish in 1,000 different accents. When it narrows, families vanish, languages dim, entire lineages disappear without a footnote. Now, walk into cold. Your lungs seize first, not from panic, but from air so sharp it stings like a reprimand. Underfoot, snow that has learned to sound like stone. Ahead, a field that is not a field, but a negotiation with winter. If you are 10 here, your first mathematics are calories, the arithmetic of marrow, fat, and time. If you are 40, you are an elder by statistical accident. Shift the lens to a village that no longer moves. Mud walls breathe in late afternoon heat, grain stacks like promises. Water is tethered into named ditches. A new bargain emerges, security traded for chores that never end. Full bowls that file down everyone's teeth, crowds that cough in unison. Turn again to a city gate yawning at sunrise. Confident, commercial. By noon, dust on the horizon writes a different policy. Supply chains, languages, loyalties, revised at a gallop. Some places capitulate and are spared. Others resist and learn a lesson that travels faster than any letter. Look now at a harbor like a throat. Ships clear their voices with canvas. Cranes choreograph the day. From rope to quay to crowded alley, one small cough forgets to stop. In ledgers, a month of names turns into silence. Church bells cannot keep up with the accounting. Finally, a sky that dins at noon. Ash behaves like weather. Rivers sulk. Animals migrate. Plans dissolve into rumor. This is not hardship and not interruption. This is suspension. If these were the only scenes, it would be easy to believe history hates us. The truth is subtler and more demanding. History tests the boundary between what bodies can endure and what societies can coordinate. Each time the test intensifies, we learn the exact price of survival. Here is the argument we will build, slowly, carefully, with evidence. The worst time to be born is not a single year, but a shape, a configuration of pressures that compresses lifespan, steals redundancy, multiplies randomness. Different shapes create comparable misery by different paths. Frozen climate, crowded disease, organized speed. Humans respond not as solo heroes, but as systems, tools, rituals, institutions, stories, meant to widen the margin between need and supply. Sometimes those inventions save us. Sometimes they backfire and sharpen the next crisis. This framing refuses nostalgia for a gentler, natural past. It refuses fatalism that shrugs suffering into inevitability. It refuses melodrama that ranks terror for spectacle rather than clarity that helps us act. A ranking still matters, not for cruelty, but for honesty. A real scoreboard forces us to count what governs survival: temperature ranges, harvest variability, pathogen transmission, mobility, coercive power, medical knowledge, and the humble brilliance of shared technique. It forces us to face the question whispered across centuries: will my child reach the age where they can have a child? Before we assemble the scorecard, hold the margins in view. On the ice field, resilience is heat and knowledge, fire as a time machine, bone needles as insulation, stories as cached memory of routes, roots, and taboos. In the village, resilience is storage and scheduling, granaries as a second stomach, irrigation as a daily argument with drought, surplus that enforces proximity and favors microbes. In the conquered city, resilience is speed and rumor management, walls built for ladders, not velocity, horses extending decisions, new laws that reroute habits and redistribute risk. In the port, resilience is information you can act on before you inhale. Quarantine shifting from improvisation to governance to culture. Masks from talisman to tool to symbol. Markets learning a city is only as healthy as its poorest street. Under volcanic ash, resilience is mobility and social memory. Pale light redefining morning. Scarcity redrawing maps. Skill as pivot, finding valleys with edible bark and shores that still host fish. What follows is not a parade of horrors, but a controlled experiment in historical reasoning. We will ask 4 constant questions of radically different eras. How hard was the environment to negotiate? How dangerous was daily biology? How violent or unstable was the order? What tools, material and mental, widened the margin? We will read bones, ledgers, and chronicles for rates, birth, death, recovery, relapse, and insist on patterns. How often, how widely, how long? We will also refuse the complacency of the present. Antibiotics exist. Satellites see storms not yet formed. Logistics can starve famine. But complexity breeds new fragilities. The global makes the local porous. A supply chain is a miracle until it isn't. An algorithm can route trucks around a flood and still fail to route compassion around a rumor. So we will answer 2 questions, once with evidence, once with honesty. When, across the human story, was it the worst time to be born? And once we have the courage to name that configuration, when is the best time to live? Not the easiest, not the richest, but the best. The widest sustainable margin between need and supply. The most resilient balance between freedom and care. At the end, we will not stop at gratitude. Gratitude is polite and insufficient. We will name what we owe the people who carried fire through wind, taught children which roots do not kill, stacked stones against impatient rivers, built relays across empty miles, and rang bells for strangers they would never meet. We owe not a museum of admiration, but the maintenance and extension of the margins they earned, so that someone not yet born can complain about school instead of calculating calories. If you want to look away and say the past is past, wait one more breath. To decide how to act in our century, we must see clearly how others acted in theirs, analysts of necessity who did math and meat, weather and rumor, and found enough slack to make next year possible. Step into the cold where the margin is thinnest and the rules are blunt. We will begin where hunger speaks louder than law, where shelter is the first technology, and where fire is the only argument that wins the night. Then we will walk forward through fields, markets, harbors, and ash, asking the same questions while the scenery changes. The thesis is simple, the evidence is not, and the answer about the worst time, the best time, and the debt will only hold if we earn it piece by piece. Breathe. Begin. Begin with the instrument, not the verdict. If you rank eras without a method, you rank fears. So we build a scorecard, a disciplined way to ask the same questions of very different centuries, and to listen when the bones, the ledgers, and the landscapes answer. 4 pressures govern whether life can continue: environment, biology, violence, resilience. Each pressure can tighten or loosen the margin between daily need and daily supply. Our task is to measure the tightening and to recognize the tools that loosen it back. Environment first, not scenery, constraints, temperature ranges that push bodies past thermoregulation, precipitation patterns that turn seed into risk, geography that traps or frees migration. We read tree rings and ice cores for volatility. We map coastlines that used to be shorelines. We track the length of hungry seasons. Cold kills, heat kills, drought kills, none kill in straight lines. What matters is variance, the swing between barely enough and suddenly nothing. Biology next. Daily life is a moving laboratory: wounds, births, fevers, nutrition. We score diets by diversity, not romance. Enamel wear and stature declines are ledgers you carry in your skeleton. We score disease by transmission opportunities: crowding, waste, water, vectors, trade velocity. We do not pretend that people understood pathogens. We ask whether their habits accidentally amplified or dampened them. A closed window may be superstition, or the first public health policy a city ever tried. Violence and social upheaval. Coercive power shortens lifespans even when swords stay sheathed. Raids, sieges, forced movement, confiscations, famines induced by policy, rumor as a weapon. These are not anecdotes, they are rates of disruption. The question is not, was there war, but how often did institutions fail to deliver safety, food, and justice at the same time? When markets are rerouted at spear point, mothers begin counting in exits, not in coins. Resilience. This is the axis that keeps the others from becoming fate. Material tools: fire, pottery, storage, textiles, metallurgy, transport. Social tools: norms, kin networks, mutual aid, ritual calendars, credit, writing, quarantine, law. Cognitive tools: maps, measurements, taboos, stories that encode how not to die. Resilience does not remove danger. It buys time. Time is the currency that turns a narrow margin into a survivable corridor. Now the unit of outcome. We do not ask only, did a person survive? We ask the intergenerational question. Did enough people reach reproductive age, and did enough of their children do the same? This is the multiplier that turns years into futures. A society can be brilliant and still fail this test. Evidence has a bias. We mostly find what survived, so we counterweight the record. Glorious monuments say a city fed some artists. Enamel lines say it fed them grit. Chronicles mourn nobles, parish books mourn everyone. Unburied pits do not mourn, they count. We take the coldness of numbers and the warmth of testimonies and refuse to let either lie alone. Weighting the scorecard matters. Environment and biology usually dominate the poorest. Violence can flatten the prosperous. Resilience lifts both, but unevenly. We weight by prevalence, duration, and reach. A cold decade that touches every hut outranks a battle that spares many. A plague year in dense trade hubs can outweigh a generation of distant skirmishes. A storage revolution can rescue millions while masking new fragilities that appear a century later. Uncertainty is not a flaw, it is honesty. We will state ranges, not slogans, likelihoods, not certainties. Where scholars disagree, we will show the hinge of the disagreement, data gaps, proxy limits, models with different assumptions. A ranking without error bars is a story. A ranking with them is an argument you can test. Survivor bias whispers that the past worked out because we are here. We answer, we are here because failures leave fewer descendants to tell their version. The silence of erased villages is part of the dataset. So we listen for disappearances, languages that stop, cemeteries that spike, then cease, irrigation networks abandoned mid-repair. Metrics, briefly, so you can see the shape of the inquiry. For environment, anomaly frequency, growing season length, forage density, predator pressure, mobility corridors. For biology, infant and maternal mortality, stature and enamel hypoplasia, pathogen routes, sanitation proxies, diet breadth. For violence, mortality spikes, displacement rates, confiscation records, trade disruption indexes, legal fragmentation. For resilience, storage capacity per capita, redundancy of water, tool complexity, knowledge transmission fidelity, institutional continuity. The scoreboard is not a moral tribunal, it is a thermometer. A century that scores worse does not damn its people. It honors their struggle by counting what they had to outwit. It also disciplines our judgment of the present. If we stand in milder weather with stronger medicines and sturdier laws, we are not more virtuous, we are more equipped. The question becomes, what will we do with equipment we did not earn alone? One more precaution before we begin to rank. Trade is a double-edged corridor. It carries salt and iron and also fleas and rumors. Connectivity spreads prosperity and synchronizes risk. When the world is tightly stitched, a tear travels. And one more promise. We will not confuse spectacle with scale. A famous sack of a city makes a great painting. A silent decade of rickets makes no painting at all. Our method privileges what altered the fates of many, across classes, genders, regions, not only what echoed in courts and chronicles. Hold the image of the scorecard in your head, 4 axes moving at once. See how one era's salvation becomes another era's vulnerability. Fire enables winter survival. Soot thickens lungs. Storage prevents famine. Crowding primes plagues. Horses make distance negotiable. Empires make obedience non-optional. Writing preserves memory. Bureaucracy preserves mistakes. Now we will apply the instrument to lived worlds. We will ask how it felt to breathe, to bleed, to barter, to bury. And we will mark how often those acts failed. We will not look for saints or villains. We will look for patterns that rerun. Begin with the terrain that lowers the ceiling on human possibility more bluntly than law or king. Cold that lingers, wind that edits breath, food that only exists if luck and skill coincide. Begin where the first technology is shelter and the second is fire, and every other invention hangs from those two. Begin where the scoreboard tilts hard toward environment and biology, and resilience must be handmade in the dark. Begin with ice. Cold is not a backdrop, it is a governing law. In the last glacial maximum, the map shrinks to corridors of survivable terrain. Refugia along coasts, river mouths that refuse to freeze, valleys spared the worst of the wind. Population is thin, mobility is mandatory, and the difference between a camp that lasts and a camp that vanishes is measured in kindling, fat, and foresight. Environment loads the dice first. Average temperatures fall, but averages mislead. What matters is the volatility that turns hunting paths to traps and thaw to false spring. Prey ranges stretch and lurch, herds appear as windfall and disappear as rumor. For humans, every journey is a hypothesis about food. Failure is not theatrical. It is quiet, a snare sprung empty, a river crossing mistimed, a shelter whose smoke failed to draft. Biology tightens next. Injury is an infection waiting for its courier. Dental wear tells the story of grit and sinew. Long bones carry faint signatures of childhood stress. Calories arrive as protein and fat, or they do not arrive, and the immune system follows the ration book. Without antibiotics, time and technique do the work of medicine. A wound is managed by fire, water, pressure, and memory, what the elders say to do when the edge slips and the skin opens. Violence, here, is not states and sieges. It is teeth, claws, cliffs, and cold water. Conflict between bands exists, but scarcity encourages avoidance more than conquest. Your most dangerous enemy cannot be bargained with. It is exposure. The social order is intimate and fragile. A few dozen lives braided by need, where a skilled hunter's fever becomes a collective crisis. Resilience is the axis that decides if the graph bends. The toolkit looks humble and is not. Fire control that works in sleet. Clothing engineered from hides and sinew. Adhesives brewed from pitch. Shelters that waste no heat. Storage tricks that turn a glut into insurance. Above the material layer sits the information layer. Finely tuned seasonal maps, species knowledge encoded in taboo and tale, and teaching that happens in the half hour after dusk when hands are idle and minds are open. Stories are not entertainment, they are compressed logistics. A child who can recite the route to a wintering ground is carrying a future in their mouth. Female labor is survival infrastructure. Hide working makes clothing that prevents pneumonia. Fuel gathering decides whether meat is cooked enough to be safe and soft enough for the very young and the very old. Childcare is a logistics problem solved with slings, social sharing, and the choreography of tasks around the fire. If you are looking for the lever that lifts lifespan, look at the quality of insulation and the fidelity of knowledge transfer, not only at the heroism of the hunt. Metrics in this world are stark. Growing season length is a rumor. Plant calories are scarce, sporadic, and seasonal. Forage density for megafauna rises and falls with ice edge dynamics. Mobility corridors, coastal shelves, river valleys, passes determine whether groups can pivot when prey do. Infant mortality is high, but not uniformly. Bands with reliable shelter design and fuel discipline push the curve. Maternal mortality tracks with tool hygiene and midwifery skill disguised as tradition. The moral temptation is to romanticize hardship into virtue. Resist it. People survived because they built redundancy where none existed. Fire-making methods are duplicated. Embers are banked in ash. Backup shelters exist in memory, if not in timber. Decision-making is conservative with risk and opportunistic with abundance. When a mammoth dies, nothing is wasted. Marrow, sinew, hide, bone, fat lamp, needle, glue. The kill is not victory, it is inventory. What does the scorecard say? Environment, severe, with spikes that erase careful planning. Biology, high risk, moderated only by hygiene born of necessity and diet quality that oscillates between feast fat and famine lean. Violence and upheaval, localized, significant when resource overlap occurs, but often avoided by movement rather than settled by battle. Resilience, strong per capita, handmade and high fidelity, but limited by carrying capacity and the narrow bandwidth of small group institutions. The paradox is this: the Ice Age is brutally constrained and yet intellectually dense. Toolkits diversify because they must. Cognition is tuned to pattern detection at the threshold of survival. Art blooms on stone, not because there is leisure, but because attention must be trained and shared. Depictions of animals are rehearsal and recall. Handprints are attendance sheets of a school without walls. Intergenerational continuity is the only outcome that matters. On that measure, Ice Age bands succeed when three things align: predictable access to fat, reliable retention of fire, and social architectures that protect pregnant and nursing bodies from the full cost of scarcity. When any one of these fails, the margin collapses quickly. Time runs out because time was the only thing being bought. What ends the era is not a vote. It is climate's slow rearrangement of possibility. Ice retreats, corridors widen, plant calories become less theoretical, and the surest way to add redundancy to the food supply is to stand still long enough to cultivate. Standing still has its own price, but from the perspective of an Ice Age ledger, it looks like compound interest. Storage promises to turn luck into plan. Hearth smoke becomes kitchen smoke. The mobility map compresses into a field. Do not read this as triumphalism. The cold taught exact lessons: how to budget heat, how to cooperate under pressure, how to treat information as a survival tool. Those lessons are portable and will be needed when standing still attracts new dangers. We leave the ice with respect, not relief. What comes next is a different configuration of the same four pressures. The climate softens and the horizon stops moving, but biology finds new routes. Violence finds new motives. Resilience migrates from the fire ring to the granary and the ditch. The scorecard will shift, not settle. Step from the wind into the furrows. Trade breath that hurts for air that smells of damp soil. Keep the questions constant while the scenery changes. Begin to count in seasons, not migrations. Begin to store. Begin to owe. Soil is not a gentler master. It is a different contract. Where mobility once converted luck into calories, residence now converts labor into probability. The wager is simple to say and hard to keep. If we stand still, food will stay near. Environment loosens one vise and tightens another. Frost retreats. Growing seasons lengthen. But rainfall becomes a metronome that can skip, and a skipped beat starves more people when those people are all in one place. The river is both pantry and threat. Silt is fertilizer and floodplain memory. A good year teaches optimism. 2 good years teach amnesia. Biology reorganizes around proximity. Diet diversity shrinks as fields succeed. Stature declines. Enamel records fine grit and repetitive starch. Iron deficiency writes its pale signature across skulls. Infant and maternal mortality do not disappear. They change their reasons. Less exposure, more infections carried by water and waste. Crowded nights speed coughs. Shared tools spread fevers. Immunity becomes a neighborhood project. Violence does not vanish behind walls. It adapts to surplus. Land has boundaries now. Stores can be seized. Labor can be taxed. Warrior classes consolidate where harvests can support them. Raids look less like escape and more like policy. A failed harvest invites bargaining. 2 failed harvests invite men with lists. Resilience migrates from fire rings to infrastructure. Ditches persuade water. Hedges and terraces persuade soil. Granaries persuade time. Pottery persuades food to wait for you. Ritual calendars persuade communities to agree on when to plant, when to build, when to clean the wells. Writing persuades memory to survive arguments. The toolkit expands by specialization. A smith no longer farms full-time. A miller no longer hunts. Knowledge localizes and deepens. Seed selection, soil rotation, fallow patterns, draft animals, harness design, kiln management. Innovation appears as a sequence of small stubbornnesses. A better yoke, a tougher jar, a canal that silts less often, a beam that creaks less in rain. None are famous. All are cumulative. Accounting enters the body and the ledger at once. On bodies, lines of stress on teeth, healed fractures from repetitive labor, pelvic adaptations to nutrition stress. In ledgers, tallies of grain, rents in kind, obligations denominated in seasons. Debt becomes a climate, invisible on clear days, storm-like when a harvest fails. The poor borrow in hunger and repay in obedience. Disease ecology learns the map of intimacy. Latrines upstream, wells downstream. One wrong order, and a village learns the cost in a week. Animals live closer. Parasites commute. Markets knit distant valleys together. Microbes hitch free rides. Quarantine emerges as custom before it matures into ordinance. A curtain across a doorway is a technology. Women's work structures survival, again. Weaving stores warmth. Grinding stores calories. Childcare coordinates labor cycles with plant cycles. Midwifery, hygiene, and timing decide futures as surely as rainfall. If resilience has a meter, it ticks loudest over the hearth and the well. Irrigation is the argument of the century. A ditch is a bet against drought. A weir is a bet against flood. These bets demand maintenance, and maintenance demands hierarchy. Who owns the upstream gate owns the downstream season. Politics hardens from custom to office, from elder to official. With office comes record, with record comes power that remembers. Storage changes the psychology of hunger. Hunger becomes a number, not a tonic. The village survives winter by design instead of desperation. But storage concentrates value. Concentration attracts force. Locks, watchtowers, and treaties are the cost of sleeping near your food. The scorecard shifts visibly. Environment, improved average, dangerous variance. Biology, chronic strains replace acute exposures. Crowd disease amplifies in wet years and pilgrim seasons. Violence and upheaval, periodic, policy-driven, sharpened by unequal stores and borders worth breaching. Resilience, infrastructural, institutional, cumulative, and path-dependent. What you build to solve last decade's flood may amplify next decade's plague. Intergenerational success becomes administrative. Children live if water is clean and calories are consistent, if mothers bear fewer infections and more protein, if the village can buffer a bad year without selling its seed. The seed loan is civilization's razor. Spend it and survive today. Keep it and survive tomorrow. A wise village leaves something unharvested on purpose. Fodder for goats, seed for birds, memory for children. Markets stretch horizons and compress distances. Salt, obsidian, copper, grain, all want roads. Roads want safety. Safety wants authority. Authority wants taxes. Taxes want records. Records want compliance. And compliance wants stories about why this is fair. Stories change. Hearth tales about surviving winter become river tales about keeping promises. Taboos that once protected scarce animals become taboos that protect calendars and contracts. Gods learn new jobs: rainfall, fertility, boundary stones, granaries. Festivals manage time and conflict simultaneously. Joy is also governance. The temptation again is romance, the village green, the communal bake oven, the security of neighbors who know your name. Hold the other side. The surveillance of reputation, the tyranny of debt, the fragility of monoculture, the slowness of reform when the ditch needs clearing this week. Security narrows freedom and widens survivability. It also accrues interest in boredom, resentment, and opportunistic power. Metrics to keep us honest: growing season length and variance, irrigation uptime, storage capacity per capita, diet Brecht indices, infant and maternal mortality trends, skeletal measures of workload, settlement abandonment rates after multi-year drought, conflict incidents per 100 settlements, disease outbreaks plotted against water and market calendars. Compare regions. Some solve drought and import plague. Others solve plague and export grain. Others solve neither and empty out slowly. And yet, despite the costs, the arithmetic of agriculture is persuasive. A hectare can feed more infants than a hunting range can. Surplus creates a buffer that weather alone could not. Specialization unlocks tools that no band could have produced in motion. Population grows not because life becomes easy, but because risk becomes legible. Then risk changes shape. Routes thicken. Caravans find each other. Languages borrow words for prices and weights. Where goods flow smoothly, the incentives to interrupt them also grow. Where towns fatten, horsemen learn to read the map by its richest shadows. The scorecard warns about coupling. The tighter the network, the faster both prosperity and cascades move. A rumor on the steppe can close a market 2 weeks away. A levy to fix an upstream gate can starve a downstream street. A triumphant treaty can soften a city's vigilance just long enough for a strategist to teach it humility. We stand now at the hinge. Fields have anchored families. Ditches have anchored fields. Records have anchored law. But roads have anchored ambitions. Speed will test storage. Psychology will test policy. And violence will discover that the shortest path to power is not through walls, but around them. Turn your attention from furrows to horizons. Listen for hooves that sound like weather. Ask what becomes of a surplus when it learns to run. The next configuration is not colder or hungrier by default. It is sharper. Not scarcity as nature, but precarity as strategy. Keep the scorecard in view. The environment is relatively kind. Biology is mixed. Resilience is infrastructural and proud. That pride will be probed at speed. Now watch the dust. Speed is not only movement, it is policy. When cavalry learns to turn distance into an ally, walls become delays rather than decisions. Power arrives as a dust line at noon, writes a new rule by dusk, and sleeps in another province by dawn. Environment recedes as the main constraint. Weather still matters. Mud slows, snow stings, but logistics now ride on hooves and discipline. What matters most is timing and surprise, the geometry of approach vectors, the cadence of feints, the choreography of retreat that is actually encirclement. Violence reorganizes the map with methods, not merely force. Composite bows extend lethal range without dismounting. Mounted archers dissolve before a countercharge, then reform where the countercharge is weakest. Signals and standards compress decision time. Relay posts make the frontier feel short. Rumor is weaponized. Spared cities tell the story that surrender buys continuity. Sacked cities amplify the cost of defiance. The choice set narrows before the vanguard even appears. Merchants hedge inventories. Magistrates hedge promises. Citizens hedge loyalty with extra water near the gate. Economy both suffers and gains. In the first wave, panic prices, shuttered stalls, caravans that unload early and cheap. In the second wave, imposed order, safer long-haul corridors, attacks on fear that buys predictable passage. Trade thickens along protected spines, even as outlying markets wither. The human ledger is uneven. Some towns are erased, others are absorbed and audited. Population falls sharply in corridors of repeated campaign, rises where order follows conquest and predation drops. Captives move, craftsmen are reseated, languages splice. Trauma is real, and so is reorganization. Biology travels with baggage. Armies carry more than arrows, fleas, lice, intestinal passengers. Refugees compress into temporary density. Rations degrade. Sanitation collapses under haste. Disease does not need permission. It needs proximity and motion. Both are now policy. Resilience changes shape. Walls no longer guarantee. Intelligence does. Scouts matter more than stones. Supply depots more than battlements. Mounted couriers more than heralds on foot. Local elites survive by reading the moving center of gravity and aligning faster than their neighbors. Institutions that can pivot, tax systems that adapt, courts that reopen quickly, storehouses that account for forced requisition, salvage continuity out of shock. Metrics reveal the signature of speed. Campaign distances per season. Time to surrender after first contact. Caravan throughput before and after pacification. Tax compliance curves under new administration. Urban abandonment rates along secondary routes. Variance in grain prices at relay hubs versus unprotected markets. Where numbers stabilize quickly, rule has become infrastructure. Where numbers oscillate, battle becomes weather. Culture responds with synthesis and scar tissue. Art shifts motifs. Names bend to new spellings. Legal codes graft clauses. Devotional practices adopt loanwords. Children learn to recognize uniforms faster than dialects. A city's pride relocates from wall height to messenger latency. The scorecard rebalances. Environment, moderate, rarely decisive except in winter campaigns and river crossings. Biology, intermittent spikes tied to displacement, sieges, and field sanitation. Violence and upheaval, acute where strategies concentrate, chronic where tributary status is contested. Resilience, operational, speed, information, logistics, and the psychology of credible threat gives rulers reach beyond what masonry ever allowed. Uncertainty persists. Chroniclers inflate victories and undercount evacuations. Tribute lists omit fugitives. Mass graves misdate if ash layers are disturbed. We triangulate. Coin hoards buried and never reclaimed. Pollen records showing untended fields. Isotopes in teeth that reveal migration of artisans and captives. The story is not only flames, it is footprints. Across the spine of empire, prosperity rides in the lee of terror. Relays shorten space. Tariffs regularize. The same corridors that carry silk and paper carry letters, monks, engineers, and pathogens. Connectivity is now continental, not regional. Synchronization increases. A drought or a rumor ripples farther and faster than in any earlier century. Parents revise their calculus. If tribute is paid, will grain still move? If the gate opens, will the school reopen? If prices stabilize, will sons be conscripted or apprenticed? Survival becomes a negotiation with speed, signed in installments. The hinge to the next era is biological, not military. Where roads are safe, caravans multiply. Where caravans multiply, nodes swell. Where nodes swell, breaths overlap. A cough that once died in a hamlet now finds a highway. The empire's greatest logistic achievement doubles as the most efficient transmission network the world has yet built. Watch the corridors of exchange. Horses become ships. Dust becomes spray. Relay posts become ports and fondacos. Ledgers brighten with ink at the same pace that clinics, temples, and kitchens dim with fever. What cavalry taught the map, compression, trade will teach the microbes. Hold the scorecard steady as the vector changes from step to sea. The next crisis will not announce itself with hoofbeats. It will clear its throat in a market, borrow a cup, and board a vessel before sunset. The bells you hear, first for cargo, then for worship, then for mourning, will ring on the same wind that once filled banners. Follow the routes to water. Count the ships, not the standards. Look for a pattern that begins with profit and ends with procession. The harbor is ready. So is the guest that does not need a gate. A harbor is a throat, and the world clears it. Canvas swells. Cranes speak in pulleys. Bales, barrels, bolts of cloth, lifted, tallied, kissed by chalk. Prophet writes the first line. A cough writes the second. Crowding is a technology of prosperity, of contact, of speed. It is also a map for a microbe that does not know it is small. From gangplank to warehouse to alley to shrine, breath overlaps like shingles on a roof. When rain comes, everything under that roof gets wet. The environment is not the aggressor here, biology is. The vector is mundane. A flea seeking a meal, a rat seeking shelter, a sailor seeking wages, a pilgrim seeking grace. The mechanism is simple, proximity plus time. The multiplier is the network we built to outwit hunger. Score the pressures. Environment ordinary. Sometimes damp, occasionally cold enough to drive people indoors. Violence, latent. Fear, scapegoats, panics at the gate, chaos at the quay. Resilience, improvised. Customs that harden into rules, gestures that harden into ordinances, stories that harden into stigma. Biology, catastrophic. Transmission that outruns comprehension. Mortality that compresses futures into days. Symptoms arrive before explanations. The first cases are anecdotes, then a pattern, then a rumor with evidence. Boils, fever, blood where breath should be. Healers reach for the tools of meaning, prayers, purges, perfumes, flames, and sometimes stumble on partial truths by accident. Distance helps, fresh air helps, fewer gatherings help. Institutions learn in public. Quarantine begins as hesitation at a rope. It matures into a clock. 40 days of waiting is not a number from medicine. It is a number from memory. Long enough to catch many cycles, short enough to trade tomorrow. Guardhouses appear beside warehouses. Harbor masters become epidemiologists with ledgers. Masks migrate from symbol to instrument. At first, they are theater, courage scented with herbs. Then they become practice, fabric that slows an invisible arithmetic. Finally, they become argument. Do we owe each other fewer breaths in public? The answer is not unanimous and never will be, but the curve listens even when people do not. Metrics anchor emotion. Parish registers spike, then fall silent. Bell towers ring until rope and arm ache. Gravediggers become logisticians. In some quarters, a third of names disappear. In others, half. In a few, more. The arithmetic is uneven, but its pressure is universal. Labor scarce, fear abundant, authority stretched thin. Markets convulse. Prices for basics jump, then collapse when there are not enough hands to buy. Skilled labor discovers leverage. Wages rise where councils are pragmatic. Riots rise where councils are not. Guilds bargain for widows. Monasteries liquidate stores. Lenders learn that interest means little in a city that has forgotten how to count the living. Culture answers with ambivalence. Art turns morbid and tender at once. Skeletons dance because laughter is cheaper than prophecy. Saints multiply because intercession feels like insurance. Wills thicken with clauses. Sermons lengthen with weather. Children play funerals because imitation is how they practice adulthood, even when adulthood is a narrower door. The temptation is to imagine only darkness. Hold the light that survived. Communities invent care as a civic competence. Soup queues, orphan rosters, rotations for the well to carry for the weak. Cities learn to publish new kinds of information. What gates are shut, what markets are open, what boats are held offshore, what streets are cleansed at dawn. Clocks, bells, and notice boards become a public health stack. The scorecard forces candor. Biology dominates, but not alone. Policy modulates outcome, where councils move quickly on distancing. The peak is lower, where fresh water is upstream and waste is downstream. The second wave is kinder, where travelers are logged and lodging holds fewer strangers per room. Chains break more often. Survival is not only luck, it is logistics disguised as compassion. Scapegoats appear when causality is scarce. Minorities suffer when fear seeks an address. Streets that once braided families now braid rumors. A terrible constant across cities and centuries. When explanation is absent, punishment volunteers. The long tail of an epidemic is grief, but its sharp point is blame. Intergenerational continuity tilts, but does not always break. After the first firestorm of mortality, the birth rate rebounds in many towns. Fewer mouths to feed, more land per household. Bargaining power for hands that remained. Some serfs become tenants. Some tenants become proprietors. Some masters become memory. The redistribution is not justice, but it is consequential. Knowledge travels with the germ, belated and stubborn. Port to port, a protocol emerges. Watch, wait, wash, space, record. Doctors write what they saw, what failed, what might have helped. Midwives teach which rooms to open, which windows to keep, which visitors to turn away kindly but firmly. Craftsmen retool. Coopers for water, tanners for aprons, smiths for hinges on gates that now matter. Evidence keeps us honest about the range of outcomes. Some towns were spared by geography, timing, or sheer luck. Others were ravaged beyond recognition. Rural pockets fared differently than market hubs. Seasons mattered. So did festivals. So did war. Stack the factors and you find a picture that is not uniform, but is persuasive. Connectivity is a gift that can hurt while it helps. We owe clarity to the dead and instruction to the living. So we read bones for stress, ledgers for emptiness, letters for the texture of fear. We ask not just how many died, but how many decisions made the living possible. Who set the rope at the pier? Who moved the market to the square with wind? Who risked reputation to close a gate early? Who opened a granary late and saved a street? Then we return to the scorecard and speak plainly. Environment, incidental, a backdrop that changes where breaths overlap. Biology, sovereign, accelerated by networks and crowded shelter. Violence and upheaval, Secondary but cruel. Pogroms, evictions, opportunistic theft, collapse of petty order. Resilience, discovered in real time, quarantine clocks, public notices, cleaner water orders, spacing norms, and the social courage to uphold them. The hinge to the next era is not a law or a treaty. It is the reminder that nature can be an enemy with no negotiator. Epidemics teach cities how to count, how to pause, how to speak in rules. But there are crises against which counting buys only clarity, not reprieve. A sky can still darken at noon. Ash can still teach noon to behave like dusk. Crops can fail not by blight, but by absence of light. Rivers can sulk for seasons. Animals can migrate along routes that ignore our roads and treaties. And a species that mastered breath and distance can be humbled by the sun itself going thin. Carry forward what we learned. Quarantine as timekeeping, records as public sense, shared care as infrastructure. We will need every inch of that margin when the world withholds daylight rather than distance. Listen now for silence rather than bells. Watch for shadows that grow without clouds. The next configuration will not come on a ship or a horse. It will arrive all at once, everywhere that the wind knows. The harbor will not be the problem. The horizon will. A shadow can fall without clouds when the sky itself learns a new color. Morning dimmer than memory. Noon, tired. Dusk, early. Ash does not shout. It settles. It edits light. It edits time. Environment takes the chair and does not share it. A super-eruption is not weather. It is governance by geology. Particles loft high enough to ride the planet's circulation. Sunlight scatters. Heat budgets fail. Growing seasons stumble. Water cycles drift out of key. Too little here, too much there. All of it late. The arithmetic tightens everywhere at once. In ordinary hardship, neighbors help neighbors because misfortune is local and offset by distance. Here, distance fails as a buffer. Your cousins over the ridge are eating the same thin light you are. Trade can move grain. It cannot move summer. Score the four pressures with cold hands. Environment sovereign. Temperatures sag, photosynthesis slows. Forage collapses across biomes. Biology, stressed rather than contagious. Malnutrition, compromised immunity, miscarriages, opportunistic infections. Violence, situational. Competition for refugia, expulsions that carrying capacity edges. Raids that follow herds that follow hope. Resilience, tested to fracture. Storage runs out, calendars lose predictability. Knowledge based on seasonal regularity requires amendments no elder can supply. Metrics leave fingerprints, even when chronicles do not. Tree rings narrow in synchrony across regions. Pollen records show fields retreat and scrub advance. Lake cores archive a gray punctuation mark that was once a sky. Faunal remains skew towards small, quick-breeding species. Large game go elsewhere or nowhere. Isotopes in bones indicate diets tilt toward whatever keeps a fire lit long enough to chew. The body becomes a ledger you can read at a glance. Stature stalls in cohorts conceived under dim light. Enamel hypoplasia writes stop and start across teeth like missed rent. Pelvises tell stories of births attempted with fewer calories to spend. Old scars reopen because protein is a prerequisite for healing. Storage, the pride of settled life, reveals its hidden assumption that next season will resemble last. When resemblance fails, storehouses measure only the distance between foresight and geology. Jar, pit, granary. Each buys time until the invoice arrives in hunger. Communities that kept seed separate from meal survive the longest. So do those that stored fat, not only grain. Mobility returns as an emergency doctrine. Groups decohere into scouting parties, then recombine near water, near coasts, near caves with drafts that still carry smoke. Paths that were trade become migration. Paths that were migration become memory of people who did not arrive. The best technology is again route knowledge. Which saddle leads to a windless hollow? Which river mouth still hosts fish under a leaden sky? Rituals strain and adapt. Calendars slip when stars fade behind high haze. Ceremonies tied to planting and harvest lose their anchors. New rites appear that ask different questions: when to move, when to stay, when to share the last of something, because alone it cannot bridge a week. Taboos soften or harden according to what the stomach allows. Violence is less a campaign than a contour. At the edges of refugia, fear patrols borders that did not exist a year before. Exclusion can feel like policy even when it is panic. Some bands specialize in taking from others. Most specialize in not being there when those bands arrive. The dominant weapon is denial of access, not siege engines. Leadership resumes its oldest job, distributing risk. The best leaders remember where the cold spring never froze, where the lichen on the north faces was thickest, where seal rookeries went quiet last time the wind stayed wrong. They ask for quiet, for patience, for a taboo against waste. They organize watch schedules not for enemies, but for weather that lies. Information, again, is survival. Stories compress experiments no one can afford to repeat. A narrative that says, "Do not eat this bark in the dim years," is a randomized trial run once at terrible cost and preserved as law. A lullaby that says, "The fish return after the third false dawn," is a statistical model with better compliance than any ordinance. The genetic record may carry an echo from such a century. Fewer lineages, narrower variation in certain markers. Yet caution is wisdom. Bottlenecks can be sharp or broad, local or continental. Signals blur over millennia. Conclusions deserve humility. What the archaeological and ecological records agree on is simpler and sufficient. A synchronized stress that pruned futures. Intergenerational continuity, the only metric that ultimately matters, becomes arithmetic with unforgiving terms. Children conceived during dim years face higher losses. Those born into them burn calories just to stay warm in summers that behave like spring. Fertility delays as bodies triage. Grandparent knowledge is priceless until the sky changes rules faster than memory can revise them. Resilience that helps most is modularity. Households that can detach and reattach to different kin clusters. Toolkits that can pivot from hunting to gathering to fishing. Social rules that permit adoption, fosterage, sharing of milk, flexible claims to land and lineage. Rigid systems crack. Flexible ones leak and still hold shape. Economy returns to survival math. There are no prices for things that are not available. There are obligations for mouths that are. Prestige redistributes toward those who can find rather than those who can store. Gifts of food are receipts for future years. Hoarding is a confession of fear and sometimes a cause of exile. The scorecard, written without sentiment. Environment, dominating variance that overtakes planning and punishes baselines. Biology, secondary collapse through malnutrition, exposure, and opportunistic disease, magnified among infants, mothers, and elders. Violence, episodic and local, meaningful where refugia are scarce, less decisive than cold. Resilience, materially clever and socially strained. Embers banked in ash, smoke managed in cramped shelters, roots memorized, tapu recompiled, authority measured in calm. What ends the dim years is not courage but physics. Particles settle. Light returns by degrees. Plants remember how to be green. Animals relearn paths. People unclench. Then misremember, too quickly, for the taste of ash to do all the teaching it might. What is learned, if we choose to keep it, is portable. Build stores, but never mistake storage for certainty. Design calendars, but leave slack for false dawns. Honor leaders, but judge them by their maps and mercy. Teach children that knowledge is a larder. The more you cash, the more winters you can afford. The worst time to be born is a shape where environment cancels distance. Biology punishes thin diets. Violence preys on the narrow, and resilience must improvise while hungry. These years fit the shape closely. Yet even here, the line does not flatline. It thins. Enough children cross the bridge because enough adults trade pride for prudence and rumor for route finding. We move forward not because the world softens on command, but because coordination grows stronger than a single season's cruelty. When the light returns, the same networks that once moved fear can be trained to move seed, tools, and rules. When the sky brightens, the habit of sharing can choose to remain brighter than the weather that taught it. Carry the scorecard out of the dim years. Environment will ease its grip. Biology will find old corridors through crowds. Violence will notice surplus again. Resilience will migrate from caves and coasts back into ditches, markets, and laws. Our task is not to relax into forgetfulness, but to audit which lessons were bought too dearly to misplace. We have walked cold, fields, dust, harbors, and ash with one instrument. Now let the instrument speak plainly. Across these configurations, where does the margin collapse the deepest and widest? Which era's pressures most reliably convert births into funerals and surplus into rumor? Turn from scenes to synthesis. Lay the four axes side by side. Ask not only which hurt most, but which hurt most people for longest, with least room to maneuver. From that clarity, we can answer the two questions you came for: the worst time to be born, and by contrast, the best time to live, and what we owe to the people who manufactured margin out of almost nothing. Hold your breath once more. We will name the shape, defend the ranking, and then turn, calmly, to the debt that follows from gratitude. Begin with the scoreboard on the table. 4 axes, 5 eras, one question that has followed us from fire ring to harbor. When did the margin between daily need and daily supply collapse the deepest, the widest, and the longest? Lay out the shapes: cold that lingers, fire as currency, mobility as law, fields that feed, proximity that sickens, storage that attracts theft, speed that redraws maps, rumor as cavalry, order by relay, harbors that hum, microbes that choose the busiest rooms, clocks that learn to quarantine, a sky that dims at noon, particles that govern crops, memory that outpaces calendars. Now make the instrument speak. Environment is a blunt instrument when synchronized, a precise threat when local. Biology kills quickest when crowds are confident. Violence steals years when policy rides faster than justice. Resilience buys time in every era, but its exchange rate changes with the threat. Score each configuration, not for spectacle, but for reach, duration, and room to maneuver. Ice and wind first. Environment, severe, variable, unforgiving. Biology, risky, but partly buffered by low density and high hygiene by necessity. Violence, present, mostly ecological, often avoidable by movement. Resilience, intimate, handmade, information-rich. Outcome, harsh ceilings, yes, but with corridors for adaptation. Migrate, diversify tools, bank embers, teach. Verdict, difficult, but maneuverable. A narrow hallway, with exits if you knew where to look. fields and ditches next. Environment, averages kinder, variance treacherous. Biology, chronic strain, crowd disease in wet years and pilgrim seasons. Violence, episodic and extractive, sharpened by borders and stores. Resilience, infrastructural, institutional, path-dependent. Outcome, more mouths fed more often, but failure clusters. One wrong gate, upstream, starves a street downstream. Verdict, survivable with bureaucracy and luck, risk legible, sometimes solvable, sometimes merely counted. Dust and hooves. Environment, secondary, opportunistic. Biology, follows displacement and supply collapse. Violence, acute, mobile, systemic. Surrender is rational until deterrence replaces mercy. Resilience, operational, intelligence, logistics, alignment. Outcome, mortality spikes in corridors of strategy, prosperity in lee of terror. Reorganization as common as ruin. Verdict, uneven, some cities erased, others improved. Fate dependent on speed of pivot rather than stores alone. Ships and bells. Environment, incidental. Biology, sovereign, accelerated by networks and crowding. Violence, secondary yet cruel. Panics, pogroms, opportunistic theft. Resilience, improvised into ordnance. Quarantine clocks, cleaner water orders, spacing norms. Outcome, steep mortality, then renegotiated labor and law. Connectivity, both culprit and cure. Verdict, catastrophic in nodes, survivable where policy moves faster than rumor. Ash and noon made dim. Environment, synchronized and dominant. Biology, secondary collapse via malnutrition and exposure. Violence, mostly local at refugee edges. Resilience, clever but starved. Storage assumes seasons that no longer arrive. Mobility resumes under global headwind. Outcome, everywhere at once, buffers fail. Neighbors cannot save neighbors because neighbors are also cold and late. Verdict, the shape most likely to convert births into funerals across regions simultaneously. If a ranking must be honest to the method, it names the worst configuration as the one where environment cancels distance. Biology punishes thin diets. Violence gains little but takes enough. And resilience must improvise while hungry. That shape belongs to the dim years of super-eruption, where the sky itself edits crops, calendars, and confidence. Second, the harbor-born epidemic, because biology learns our routes and outruns compassion unless governance gets there first. Third, the age of organized speed, because policy on horseback can compress many misfortunes into a single campaign season. Fourth, the agricultural bet, because while averages improved, variance and crowd disease create chronic drag rather than universal collapse. Fifth, the ice, because even as it bites, it leaves corridors for movement and learning. Disagree? Good. A scoreboard that cannot be argued with is not a method, it is a slogan. So test the hinges. Reach. How far did each crisis extend at once? Dim years win by cruelty of geography, globalized by wind long before trade ever was. Ports come second, globalized by ships but with seams. Inland hamlets sometimes escape. Cavalry third, globalized by logistics, yet bounded by terrain and campaign range. Agriculture and ice are regional in their pain. Though the regions are large, duration. How long did the pressure hold? The super-eruption lingers until the sky forgets its own dust. Years. Plagues arrive in waves, months to a few years, with aftershocks. Conquest rides in seasons, campaign years, punctuated by consolidations. Agriculture's chronic stresses are a long, low song. The ice is a long, high wind, but both permit local wins in the meantime. Room to maneuver. How many strategies existed that could plausibly widen the margin? Under ash, the list is shortest. Move to refugia, share, stretch stores, no roots, all under the same dim sun. In plague, the list is longer. Distance, air, water order, quarantine, record care. Under cavalry, strategy is institutional. Pivot, align, hide inventory, keep relays honest. In agriculture and ice, strategy is cumulative. Infrastructure and information. Edge cases matter. Some cities in plague years were spared by accident of timing and water. Some caravans prospered under harsh masters. Some valleys in dim years had microclimates that made them exempt and valuable. Some foragers died in good weather because a river lied. But the ranking is not a story about exceptions. It is a map of probabilities. Now, test the metric that matters most: intergenerational continuity. In dim years, fertility delays, infant mortality spikes, elders die early, and the knowledge they hold leaks into the ground with them. In plague years, mortality is shocking but brief. The survivors sometimes inherit leverage, land, and wages that support rebounds. In conquest years, continuity depends on a decision at a gate and the speed of a scribe. In agriculture, continuity is administrative: wells, seed, midwives, and the politics of the upstream sluice. In the ice, continuity is a function of fat access, fire control, and protection of pregnant bodies. Allow for uncertainty. Data are patchy, proxies noisy, chronicles biased. So we triangulate: tree rings, pollen, lake cores, enamel lines, coin hoards, burial pits, isotopes, parish books, price series, relay logs. Where these agree, confidence rises. Where they conflict, we show the hinge rather than hide it. With that rigor, call the worst time a shape rather than a date, a century in which sunlight thins, seasons break their promises, grain becomes arithmetic, meat becomes rumor, and neighbors cannot buffer neighbors because their margin is also gone. This is not cruelty by king or incompetence by council. It is geology using the atmosphere as a lever. Now, pivot not to celebration, but to contrast. If there is a worst shape, there must be a best shape. One that widens the margin sustainably, buffers variance, disciplines biology without crushing freedom, and scales resilience beyond kin without losing compassion. Define it before you name it. Environment, tamed enough by prediction and engineering that weather rarely starves a province. Biology, governed enough by sanitation, vaccination, and treatment that a cough does not close a city. Violence, hemmed by institutions strong enough to arbitrate, weak enough to be audited, and fast enough to adapt. Resilience, diversified, storage, networks, knowledge, law, care, with redundancy across all four. Then test whether any era fits. Ask, do we have food systems with multiple crops, multiple continents, multiple routes? Do we have health systems that see microbes earlier than bells do? Do we have laws that can be criticized without horses at the door? Do we have information that travels faster than rumor and can be believed more often than fear? If you are tempted to answer yes without caveat, slow down. Complexity breeds failure modes that are new: synchronized supply chains, algorithmic blindness, institutional fatigue, misinformation with cavalry speed. But if you are tempted to answer no, ask yourself, when else could a flood be seen from space, a vaccine be delivered across oceans, a famine be prevented by logistics and public will, a plague be mapped in days rather than generations? The The best time, like the worst, is a shape, not a party date. It is the configuration in which redundancy is boring, sanitation is invisible, peace is procedural, and compassion is logistical. Its signature is not the absence of crisis, but the presence of slack, extra time, extra stock, extra options, available not only to the lucky, but to the ordinary. Name it carefully in the next breath. Explain why the margin is wider now in many regions than it has ever been, and why that margin narrows for many others because climate, conflict, and neglect still do the old work in new places. Refuse arrogance. Demand accuracy. A ranking that flatters us is entertainment. A ranking that informs obligation is policy. We have reached the fulcrum of the film. We have shown our instrument, tested it against lived worlds, and stated a ranking with humility and reasons. What remains is to justify the claim about the best time to live, not with slogans, but with the same discipline. Environment, biology, violence, resilience. Measured, compared, earned. Then we must answer the question that makes rankings worth making. What do we owe to those who carried us to this wider margin? Not applause, not myth, not nostalgia. We owe maintenance, extension, and inclusion, the work of keeping redundancy redundant, of bringing the boring miracles to the places that still count seasons by hunger, of making the scoreboard gentler for children we will never meet. Hold the scorecard one more time. Turn it toward the present. Count honestly. If the shape fits, say so, and then say what it demands. Now, step into the present with the same calm we used for the past. Name the best configuration if it is ours. Admit its costs and map the debt. Begin the accounting of gratitude that spends in repairs, not in speeches. Begin with the present, not as celebration, but as an audit. Ask the scorecard to speak to now, not to your city, not to your feed, to our configuration. Environment first. We do not control weather, we predict it. Satellites watch storms that have not yet formed. Models turn ocean heat into 5-day cones. Sensor networks whisper when a river will forget its banks. We have learned to preposition grain, raise levees before floods, cut power to save lives instead of waiting to count them. Drought arrives, and irrigation pivots from canal to drip. A cyclone spins, and 1 million text messages evacuate a coastline that, a century ago, would have learned only by wind and window. This is not conquest of nature. It is calendar plus radar, time bought in bulk. Biology next. Sanitation invisible to you is visible to microbes. Sewers route waste away from wells. Chlorination, filtration. Ultraviolet light. Quiet miracles you do not post about. Vaccination turns your immune system into a library. Antibiotics and antivirals remain fire exits, even as resistance reminds us that exits can narrow. Clinics map outbreaks faster than bells. Labs sequence in hours what used to remain myths for years. Wastewater becomes early warning rather than last confession. Most babies live. Most fevers are annoying, not fatal. Most wounds end in paperwork, not funerals. The curve has not vanished, but it has bent. Violence and social upheaval without romance. States fail. Wars still teach children geography by siren. But law, where it holds, arbitrates disputes that used to be settled by rating. Elections, courts, civil society, professional bureaucracies, boring structures that keep prices from becoming threats and rumors from becoming policy. Insurance and social safety nets convert shocks into payments rather than famines. Not everyone enjoys this scaffolding. Where it exists, lifespans lengthen for reasons as unpoetic as pension accounting and routine vaccines. Resilience is no longer only a hearth or a ditch. It is redundancy at scale. Multiple crops, multiple suppliers, multiple routes. Cold chains for medicine, warehouse inventories for food, grid interconnections for power, cloud backups for data, early warning systems for quakes and storms, parametric insurance that pays by sensor, not by visit, mutual aid networks that route help within hours, not generations. Education scales memory. The internet, when trusted, scales how fast we can update what we think is true. Score it cautiously. Environment. Risk shifted from average to variance. Prediction buys time, but not immunity. Climate change reintroduces the language of extremes. Heat waves that last too long. Rains that arrive all at once. Seas that forget shorelines. Biology dominated by prevention and treatment, threatened by zoonoses, resistance, and complacency. A cough can still close cities if trust fails faster than vaccines ship. Violence, asymmetric, algorithmically accelerated. Coups and invasions remind us that institutions are not self-cleaning, yet where institutions hold, conflict per capita remains lower than in eras when policy rode on horses. Resilience, diversified, digitized. Sometimes fragile because interdependence can synchronize failure. Still, redundancy and information let many communities absorb shocks that would once have erased them. Room to maneuver has widened. Early warning, cash transfers, global grain reserves, mutual recognition of qualifications for nurses and engineers during crisis, portable diagnostics, mRNA platforms that can be tuned. Now, the caveats you must not skip. Interdependence couples our fates. A factory fire can idle an ICU a continent away. Supply chains are miracles until one bridge fails. Then, just in time turns into just too late. Information systems democratize knowledge and also weaponize lies at scale. Rumor regained cavalry speed, this time in your pocket. The planet is warming. Old floods learn new neighborhoods. Harvest maps must unlearn nostalgia faster than politics likes. Antibiotic resistance erodes a century of comfort, one prescription at a time. Inequality localizes the worst of every curve. The storm hits everyone. The roof fails only some. So the present is not exempt from the old arithmetic. It is equipped. Best does not mean easy. It means most ways to widen the margin if we choose to act in time. The operative verb is choose. Count where choice has already moved the curve. Child mortality down because vaccines and clean water are policy, not charity. Famines rare where roads, markets, and media keep leaders honest. Disaster death tolls lower when forecast and evacuation become habit, not heroism. Poverty recedes where schooling includes girls and rights include those who were previously stored outside statistics. This is not a victory lap, it is a receipt. Now count where choice is late. Heat maps that align with redlined neighborhoods. Coastal villages whose ancestors did not sign the treaty with the sea. Hospitals that can code in 10 languages yet cannot afford oxygen. Regions where war erases 20 years of public health in one season. Databases that know the outbreak but cannot convince the street. The scorecard forces the next questions. If the present fits the best shape for many, how do we extend that shape to the places still living inside older configurations? Ice bite in high latitudes, plague logic in crowded settlements, cavalry politics in fragile states, ash economy after fire or drought? What travels well? What must be planted, not shipped? Travel what we know works. Water you can drink, pipes, pumps, protection. Food you can count on, diverse crops, regional reserves, open ports during need. Health you can reach, primary care, vaccines, supply chains that are boring and audited. Information you can trust, public dashboards, community radio, local translators of science who answer questions without contempt. Law you can invoke, IDs, registries, dispute resolution that costs less than the crime it prevents. Cash in crisis, digital rails, no fee transfers, hands that get help within days, not memorials within weeks. Plant what cannot merely travel. Trust, built over time by showing up with accuracy and humility. Institutions, staffed by people who are paid to be boring and honest. Representation, so policies do not imagine citizens that do not exist. Local capacity, so a storm or a rear does not need an invitation from abroad to be answered. The modern instrument adds one axis the ancients did not have the luxury to debate. Carbon, the best shape narrows if the atmosphere keeps our receipts. So resilience must include mitigation or resign itself to permanent triage. That means grids that waste less, buildings that leak less, farms that sequester more, transit that burns less, diets that grow within soil's budget, not as sacrifice theater, as arithmetic. Intergenerational continuity, our final metric, now depends as much on governance as on weather. Does a child have a legal identity? Does a mother have prenatal care and rights? Does a teenager breathe air that will not translate into asthma and then into poverty? Does a family face ruin after one diagnosis, or do we socialize the cliff so that the descent is a ramp? Continuity is politics with a heartbeat. Say the thesis aloud so that obligation cannot hide. This era, for many, not for all, offers the widest, sustainable margin humans have known. Not omniscience, not invulnerability. Options. Options to move early, to treat early, to pay early, to rebuild early. Options that turn disasters into difficult years rather than eras. Options create debt. We owe back to the past, not mausoleums, but maintenance. Keep the sewers working, the vaccine fridges cold, the dams honest, the courts boring. We owe extension. Tape the boring miracles to the margins. We owe inclusion. Widen who gets counted, who gets warned, who gets evacuated, who gets to say, we. We owe memory. Teach the arithmetic of margins so that comfort does not breed contempt for maintenance. If you want a sentence to carry out of this room, carry this. The best time to live is the one with the most ways to buy time for others. If that time is ours, then our ranking is not flattery, it is assignment. Inventory the tools we did not inherit evenly. Forecasting. Sanitation, vaccines, logistics, law, cash rails, education, carbon math. Now inventory the gaps where a child's odds still depend more on latitude and luck than on policy and care. The overlap between these lists is where the debt is payable. A final caution against the old temptations. Nostalgia will tell you the past was purer. Fatalism will tell you the future is sealed. Melodrama will tell you that only spectacle moves hearts. The scorecard tells you something else. Maintenance is heroic. Inclusion is radical. Boring is a strategy. Keep the water clean. Keep the data honest. Keep the rumors slower than the remedy. We have named the worst shape without hating the people inside it. We have named the best shape without lying about its cracks. What remains is the simplest, hardest part. To act as if the scoreboard is a tool, not a trophy. To spend gratitude as repairs. To treat resilience not as a lifestyle, but as a public utility. Breathe once for those who carried fire through wind, once for those who stacked stones against impatient rivers, once for those who rang bells until their arms failed. Then breathe again, on purpose, because we can choose to make that breath less expensive for someone else tomorrow. Set the ledger in front of us one last time. Environment, biology, violence, resilience. 4 axes that traced our path from ice to ash, from hoofbeats to harbor bells, from rumor to radar. The question is no longer which era hurt most. The question is what a fair debt looks like in the era with the widest room to maneuver. Define the margin we inherited. We wake with weather forecasts, not omens. We drink water that does not guess at safety. We bring infants home as a routine, not a miracle. We settle disputes with filings, not fires. We rebuild after storms from warehouses already stocked, because logistics treated tomorrow as a client. This is not luck alone. It is accumulated maintenance, written by millions of hands, that never made it into epics. Name the obligations that follow. First, maintenance. Keep the dull miracles dull. Sewers that do not back up. Circuits that trip instead of killing. Dams that confess before failing. Vaccine fridges that stay boringly cold. Budget for inspections the way temples once budgeted for offerings. Heroism is the overtime of systems. Systems should not live on overtime. Second, extension. If the best shape is a public utility, it must reach public lives. Take clean water where the map is still printed in cholera. Take clinics where obstetrics is still a coin toss. Take early warning where the radio goes dead when the river rises. Do not export speeches. Export spare parts, service manuals, grants that buy time, teachers who train teachers and leave the chalk behind. Third, inclusion. The scoreboard is not honest until everyone is counted at the same resolution. Write identities for the undocumented so help can find them. Translate the weather into languages that storms already learned. Design evacuation plans for wheelchairs, for night shift workers, for neighborhoods that distrust sirens because sirens once meant raids. Widen who says we, not as poetry, but as procurement. Fourth, prevention with receipts. Climate arithmetic is not a mood. It is accounting. Reduce what leaks and what burns. Electrify where combustion teaches bad habits. Build shade where heat maps and redlined maps overlap. Grow diets within soil's budget and let forests keep their contracts with rain. A ton not emitted is a hospital not overwhelmed in some future summer. Fifth, information that can be believed. Publish dashboards that admit error bars and correct themselves in public. Treat rumor as a rival with cavalry speed. Outpace it with humility and proof. Fund local translators of science, nurses, pastors, radio hosts who answer questions without contempt and update the script. Sixth, redundancy as culture. Diversify crops, suppliers, routes, fuels, storage, skills. Teach children a second way to do every essential thing. How to purify water without a filter. How to stay warm without a grid. How to move money when a tower falls silent. Make boring backups visible so gratitude has something to point at besides rhetoric. Seventh, institutional humility. Audit the tools that make us proud. Simulate failure. Practice handoffs across agencies. Publish near misses with the same energy as successes. When a plan survives without being used, call it a win, not waste. A system that cannot survive a headline is not a resilient system. Eighth, intergenerational continuity as policy. Give every birth a name in a ledger that opens doors. Guarantee prenatal care as infrastructure, not philanthropy. Treat schools as famine prevention with a 40-year delay. Make bankruptcy policy a bridge, not a trapdoor, so one diagnosis does not erase a decade of progress. Continuity is the dividend when society agrees not to let a single bad year become a family's permanent climate. Ninth, dignity during interruption. When a storm or a plague arrives, do not merely count the living, pay them in time. Rent deferrals that prevent eviction, utility grace periods that prevent darkness, food programs that prevent panic buying, telehealth that prevents crowded waiting rooms. Design the pause so recovery is a ramp, not a cliff. Now look backward with clean gratitude. To the hands that banked embers in ash, we owe clinics that bank vaccines in fridges. To the backs that hauled water from rivers, we owe pipes that never ask a mother to gamble. To the feet that outran hooves, we owe courts that outrun vengeance. To the bells that tolled for strangers, we owe networks that warn before the coughing starts. To the elders who fed us stories with maps tucked inside, we owe curricula that teach margins as a civic habit. Answer the two questions plainly. When was it the worst time to be born? When the sky thinned and seasons broke their promises, when environments synchronized suffering, biology punished thin diets, violence added edges, and resilience improvised while hungry. Not a date, a shape. When is it the best time to live? When redundancy is normal, sanitation is invisible, medicine is quick, law is boring, information is corrigible, and compassion is logistical. For many, that configuration is now. Not everywhere, not evenly, but measurably. Do not confuse best with safe. Best means the most ways to buy time for others. If our era offers those ways, the ranking is not applause. It is assignments due. List them and keep the list on the refrigerator of public life. Maintain the boring miracles. Extend them to the margins. Include everyone at the same resolution. Prevent by arithmetic, not theater. Publish corrections faster than rumors. Stock redundancy as culture. Practice humility in institutions. Protect continuity in families. Design dignity into pauses. Close the ledger with the only sentence that makes sense after a long audit. We did not inherit comfort. We inherited capacity. Capacity is not a trophy. It is a tool to be handed, sharpened, and used until some future child rolls their eyes at the memory that humans once counted winters by hunger. Set the tools down, but do not put them away. We have named the worst shape without flinching. We have named the best shape without boasting. What remains is the everyday courage of maintenance. Keep the water clean. Keep the data honest. Keep the rumor slower than the remedy. Keep the margin wide enough for strangers. Teach the scoreboard to children, not as fear, as literacy. Environment, biology, violence, resilience. 4 axes they can trace with a finger on a map. Then in their neighborhood, then in their lives. Let them see how a clinic is a kind of granary, how a ledger of vaccinations is a story about grandmothers, how a forecast is a gift of time. Honor the boring miracles, a switch that trips instead of killing, a bridge that confesses before failing, a nurse who translates science into comfort at 3 a.m. None of these belong in epics, yet all of them hold the line. Remember the ledger we closed. Maintenance, extension, inclusion, prevention with receipts, information that can be believed, redundancy as culture, institutional humility, continuity as policy, dignity during interruption. Choose 2 to start this week. Call a utility and ask about their sensors. Ask your school where the air changes per hour are posted. Learn the evacuation route you hope to never need. Donate not only money, but spare capacity, skills, time, backups, to the places where the margin runs thin. Refuse the old temptations. Nostalgia that edits out the funerals. Fatalism that confuses difficulty with destiny. Melodrama that prefers spectacle to solutions. Choose the discipline of repairs. If you are born into the best shape, treat it like a loan. Pay interest in public work. Volunteer. Vote. Verify. Vaccinate. Pay principle in patience. Argue in good faith. Correct in daylight. Share credit. Share blame. Share slack. If you were born into a thinner margin, accept no lectures, accept partners. Demand receipts, not slogans. Demand sewers before statues, clinics before speeches, fair maps before proud ones. Your insistence is not complaint, it is continuity asking for its due. Carry gratitude like a tool, not a trophy. Gratitude that inspects dams, gratitude that funds boring budgets. Gratitude that keeps a spare key at the neighbor's house, because resilience is shared or it isn't. When you breathe tonight, imagine the chain of decisions that made that breath cheap. Fire carried through wind. Seeds kept for spring. Gates closed early. Hands that did not know your name and helped anyway. We live inside their margin. Now widen it. If this story taught you anything, let it be this. The best time to live is the one with the most ways to buy time for others. That is not a slogan. It is a schedule. Take one action that moves the curve. Sign up to give blood. Check a neighbor's generator before the storm. Support the clinic that keeps the night shift lit. Push for the policy that turns famine into a footnote. Then take one action that moves the story. Teach a child to boil water and to read a chart. Teach them how to ask a better question than, is it scary? Teach them to ask, what widens the margin? We will end as simply as we began. History is a rotating set of constraints. Some hands are difficult, some are unwinnable. Tonight, you can stack the deck marginally, meaningfully, in someone else's favor. If you found clarity here, carry it outward. Share the scoreboard. Share the repairs. Share the slack. And when the next siren sounds, or the next rumor gallops, or the next sky goes strange, remember, the assignment is not to be fearless. It is to be useful, to keep the margin open long enough for another child to grow bored of safety. Breathe.